Welcome to Revisit Books podcast, where we turn books into bite-sized wisdom you can use every day. Today, we are immersing ourselves in a text of profound and, I think, unexpected power. Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. Now, this isn't just a memoir, though it certainly is that. It's really a foundational document of modern existential thought. It weaves together this harrowing autobiography, the brutal truth of concentration camps, with a pretty revolutionary psychiatric theory. It really changed how we understand human motivation.
It truly is a document forged in fire, you could say. Frankl was already, established as one of Europe's leading psychiatrists before the Nazi era. He was standing firmly in that influential Viennese tradition. You had Freud, then Adler.
The big names.
Exactly. But his experience, it led him to develop something entirely new, what became known as logotherapy, or the third Viennese school of psychotherapy.
And the context, it's absolutely critical for understanding the weight of his argument, isn't it?
Yeah.
Frankl spent years as a prisoner, shuffled through these just unspeakable conditions, camps like Auschwitz and Dachau.
Terrible places.
He watched almost his entire world just vanish. His mother, his father, his brother, and his wife all perished in the camps or gas chambers. Only his sister survived.
And it's so important to stress, like you said, this theory wasn't developed in some, comfortable academic setting. An ivory tower. It was created right there, in the crucible. Frankl was stripped, as he put it, to naked existence. He was witnessing the ultimate organized attempts to dehumanize people.
Just systematic degradation.
Completely. And he developed logotherapy not just as a treatment, but he saw it as the humanization of psychiatry. And it was tested by the absolute limit of human endurance. The book itself, first published in Austria in 1946, it's really a living precedent to the fact that even when your body is utterly controlled, your spirit, your inner core can remain free.
Okay, so let's try and unpack this monumental work. Maybe starting with its accidental success. It wasn't meant to be the bestseller it became.
No, not at all. The book's success is actually astounding. It's an international phenomenon, published in, 19 languages, I think? Millions and millions of copies sold in English alone. Yet Frankl himself, he viewed this popularity not as a personal triumph, but actually with a degree of alarm.
Alarm. That's interesting. Why alarm?
Well, he interpreted its bestseller status as, and this is his quote, an expression of the misery of our time.
Wow. That's perhaps one of the most chilling diagnoses of the 20th and now the 21st centuries. If hundreds of thousands, millions of people are urgently reaching for a book about finding meaning.
Yeah. It signals something, doesn't it?
Yeah, it signals this widespread, maybe fundamental lack of purpose in modern society. It's like we've outsourced our meaning somehow.
Precisely. And the structure of the book is really key to its authority. It's essentially two parts, and they validate each other. Part one is the gritty, personal, autobiographical account, experiences in a concentration camp. And Frankl makes it clear that this isn't just a record of atrocities, though those are certainly present. It's a psychological study. He's observing the typical prisoner's mental journey through shock, then apathy, and then for a few, this kind of spiritual transcendence.
I think the focus of part one is what makes it so relatable, strangely enough.
Yeah.
Even for those of us who thankfully haven't experienced trauma on anything near that scale, he deliberately shifts focus away from the great horrors, which can almost be overwhelming, maybe too abstract to grasp.
Right, they numb you.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And he focuses instead on the multitude of small torments, the daily grind.
Yes, the daily grind of humiliation. That's a good way to put it. He details the everyday reality. The gnawing hunger that makes dreams of food the only dreams you have. The lack of sentimentality, the kind of necessary emotional death that you needed just to survive day to day. He chronicles this regression to a primitive life, where your entire world just revolves around getting an extra scoop of watery soup or maybe avoiding a capricious beating from a guard or a capo.
He talks quite unflinchingly about the hard fight for existence that broke down ethical barriers, even among the prisoners themselves. This is where it gets really uncomfortable, but also incredibly profound, I think.
It really does. It shows the devastating effect of extremity on the human moral structure. Frankl recounts this ethical breakdown, the horrifying reality where survival sometimes meant betraying another prisoner, maybe arranging for them to take your place on a transport, knowing full well its final destination was probably the gas chambers.
That's hard to even comprehend.
It is. And he notes, with this heartbreaking insight, that the ethically best men often did not return. They couldn't or wouldn't shed their scruples enough to survive that animalistic environment. They held on to their humanity and often paid the ultimate price for it.
So this raw, first-hand account then provides the existential validation, really, for the theoretical framework he lays out in part 2, which is called logotherapy in a nutshell. He's not just presenting a theory out of thin air. He's presenting a proven mechanism for survival, tested in the absolute worst conditions imaginable.
Absolutely. The camp experience proved that when everything external is stripped away, possessions, status, family, even basic comfort, what determines survival or death, mentally and often physically, is the prisoner's capacity to connect with some kind of irreducible inner core of meaning, something unique to them.
So if that was the testing ground, the concentration camp, who needs this message now? In our contemporary, relatively comfortable world.
Yeah.
Because while the context is historical and horrific, the psychological insights feel incredibly relevant to modern life, don't they?
Oh, completely. Frankl's insights are universal, I think. But he speaks very directly to those suffering from what he identifies as existential distress, that feeling that life simply lacks an ultimate compelling purpose, a kind of hollowness.
Which brings us to maybe the first group who this book is really for.
Yeah.
The despairing. Those suffering from that feeling of total and ultimate meaninglessness in their lives. But Frankl has a surprisingly positive spin on this despair, which feels a bit counterintuitive at first.
He does. He suggests that asking the question, what is the meaning of life, even when it comes wrapped in profound suffering, is actually a sign of health. It shows you're a human being, grappling with human questions, not just an automaton going through the motions. The despair itself, he argues, is often a frustrated desire for meaning. It's actually the starting point of logotherapy, not the end point.
That's a hopeful perspective.
Yeah.
And then there are maybe the overwhelmed, people facing, information overload, constant frustration, or those who suspect their misery isn't just a simple case of, say, chemical imbalance that a pill can fix.
Yes. Frankl frames this despair, or what he calls noogenic neuroses. Neuroses arising from the spiritual or meaning dimension, not as a mental disease in the typical sense, but as a crisis of growth and development. This is really key. It's the therapist's job, in Frankl's view, not just to tranquilize the symptoms away, but to guide the patient through that crisis toward finding a deeper meaning. He offers hope that the struggle itself is part of finding a better, more authentic self.
I also find his advice for the achiever really fascinating. The people intensely focused on external metrics of success, wealth, status, maybe even this relentless pursuit of guaranteed perpetual happiness. Our culture really pushes us to aim high, right? Climb the ladder. But Frankl kind of challenges that ambition.
Oh, he fundamentally challenges it. His advice is quite radical in a success-driven world like ours. He says, don't aim at success. The more you aim at it and make it a target, the more you're going to miss it. Success, like happiness, he believed, cannot be pursued. It must ensue.
Ensue. How does that work?
It ensues, he says, as the unintended side effect of one's personal dedication to a cause greater than oneself, or as the byproduct of one's surrender to a person other than oneself. He basically makes success and happiness side effects. If you aim for them directly, you miss them every single time.
But how does that work practically? Say if you're an entrepreneur trying to build a business, doesn't the ambition, the striving for success kind of have to come first? How do you reconcile that need for tangible achievement with this idea of transcendence?
That's a great question. Frankl would argue, I think, that the tangible achievement itself should be seen as a byproduct. So the entrepreneur who is only motivated by the pursuit of wealth for wealth's sake, or power for power's sake, they'll likely feel empty even if they achieve it, maybe especially if they achieve it. But the entrepreneur who is genuinely dedicated to solving a real societal problem or creating something of genuine value for others, someone who is passionately focused on that external cause, then the success, the financial reward, maybe the recognition, those become consequences of fulfilling that external meaning. The motivation shifts, you see, from the ego focused on power or pleasure to the mission focused on meaning.
That reframing, it must be incredibly freeing for people caught in that rat race mentality. It turns the entire pursuit of a fulfilling life kind of inside out.
It really does. And finally, Frankl speaks directly to who we might call the modern sufferer, the person experiencing what he saw as the great crisis of our time, the existential vacuum.
Tell us more about this vacuum. It sounds like something particularly endemic to the 20th and now the 21st centuries.
It really is. Frankl observed that modern man, unlike animals, has lost the basic instincts that told him what he must do. And unlike in previous eras, the strong traditions that told him what he ought to do have also crumbled.
So no instincts, new traditions.
Yeah,
what's left?
Exactly. He's left floating, often lacking direction. He doesn't know what he must do. He doesn't know what he ought to do. And sometimes, Frankl said, he doesn't even know what he wants to do. This vacuum manifests profoundly as pervasive boredom, a key symptom, and a lack of purpose. And when man doesn't know what he truly wants or finds meaningful, he often resorts to two things, according to Frankl, which are, first, conformism, doing what others do, letting the culture, the crowd, social media, whatever, dictate his identity and choices. Or second, totalitarianism, doing what others wish him to do, seeking external structure and purpose through rigid ideological control, letting leaders or systems tell him what to value.
Wow. So that connects the individual crisis, that inner emptiness, directly to these huge mass social and political movements. The search for meaning can lead to some really terrible outcomes if it's misdirected toward an external absolute authority that promises all the answers.
Absolutely. The vacuum is often unconsciously filled, Frankl believed, with things like depression, aggression, and addiction. It's an inner emptiness projected outward, or maybe an attempt to numb the emptiness. The cure, therefore, must be internal. It involves finding an inner direction, a personal meaning that cannot be provided by the state, or by social media trends, or by just following the crowd.
Okay, that sets the stage perfectly. Let's transition now to the core lessons, the key takeaways, gleaned from Frankl's experiences and his theory. We need to unpack the central concepts that really make logotherapy revolutionary.
All right, let's start with the absolute foundation.
Okay.
Okay, key takeaway 1. The will to meaning is man's primary drive.
The will to meaning.
Yes, as we mentioned, logos is Greek for meaning. Logotherapy asserts that this will to meaning is the primary, the most fundamental motivational force in human beings. Frankl saw this as the highest and deepest drive, and the camp, tragically, was his horrific laboratory for proving it.
Let's dive a bit deeper into that contrast with the other big Viennese schools.
Mm-hmm.
We had Freud with the will to pleasure, right? The hedonistic drive. And then Adler with the will to power, the striving for superiority or significance. Why did Frankl argue that these concepts were, well, insufficient or maybe even obsolete, especially when faced with extremity?
Because the camp experience rendered pleasure and power completely meaningless, or at least unattainable, for the average prisoner. What possible pleasure could there be when you're starving, freezing, constantly under threat? What power could a prisoner possibly strive for when they're reduced to a number, completely at the mercy of a guard or a capo? When these drives, which Freud and Adler saw as primary, were utterly denied or neutralized, Frankl saw that something else kept certain men going, something deeper.
And the survival stories he tells, they really reinforce this beautifully, don't they?
They absolutely do. When prisoners were stripped of literally everything, their possessions, their family ties, their professional status, their names, even the simple drive to feel comfortable, what kept them clinging to life were these often slender threads, as he called them, of unique personal meaning. This wasn't just a general survival instinct like an animal fighting for life. It was a reason for survival, a specific why.
You mentioned Frankl's own driver earlier, his scientific manuscript. Can you elaborate on that particular anecdote? It seems so central to his own survival.
It really was. When Frankl entered Auschwitz, he had his scientific manuscript hidden. It was basically the culmination of his life's work up to that point stitched into the lining of his coat. He watched it fall to the ground during the initial processing, and an SS officer dismissed it with some contemptuous obscenity. That moment, for him, was when his past life felt truly severed, utterly gone.
Devastating.
Completely.
Yeah.
But instead of letting that break him, the intense need, the responsibility he felt to rewrite that manuscript became his future anchor, his reason to endure. He started scribbling notes on tiny scraps of paper, even in the margins of camp documents, hiding them meticulously. That unique, specific responsibility to reconstruct his work, to bring it back to life, became the irreducible why that allowed him to bear the almost unbearable how of camp life.
So it wasn't just a vague hope of survival, but this very specific, concrete, waiting task that made the crucial difference for him.
Exactly. And this leads directly to another key concept in logotherapy, neodynamics. Which sounds technical, but the idea is simple. Modern psychology often pushes for inner equilibrium, for tension reduction, stress less, feel calm, find your balance. Frankl argues almost the opposite. He says a certain amount of tension, the dynamic tension created by striving toward a worthwhile goal, toward a meaning yet to be fulfilled, is actually an indispensable prerequisite of mental health.
So the striving itself, even the discomfort of that gap between what you are and what you feel you ought to be or could achieve, that's healthy. Not something to be eliminated.
It is vital. He believed that if there is no tension, if you achieve perfect equilibrium or homeostasis, you risk falling into that existential vacuum we talked about. The human spirit requires the challenge of a purpose worthy of its dedication. There needs to be something pulling you forward. This is why Frankl emphasizes that man is ultimately pulled by meaning rather than just pushed by internal drives. The why is often external, it's out there calling us forward, not just internal and demanding immediate gratification like pleasure or power often are.
And this is all crystallized, isn't it, in that famous Nietzsche quote he relied upon so heavily.
Precisely. It was almost his mantra in the camps. He who has a why to live for can bear with almost anyhow. Logotherapy, essentially, provides the framework for helping people identify their unique why, giving the prisoner, or indeed the modern sufferer, the resilience needed to face almost anyhow.
Okay, that's a powerful foundation. What's the next key takeaway?
Key takeaway 2. The last of the human freedoms.
The last of the human freedoms. This might be the most powerful, maybe the most enduring philosophical achievement of the book. This affirmation of inner strength, even when outer freedom is completely, utterly absent. What exactly is this last of human freedoms?
Well, Frankl observed that the entire concentration camp system was meticulously designed to strip the prisoner of his identity, reduce him to a mere number, and force a regression to purely animalistic concerns, just finding food, seeking warmth, avoiding pain. Yet even under this relentless psychological and physical pressure, he saw that a final core of human capacity remained untouched, or at least could remain untouched. And that was the ability to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way.
And that choice, it determined everything, didn't it? In terms of their inner experience, it determined whether you submitted entirely to the dehumanizing powers trying to rob you of your inner self, becoming what Frankl called a typical inmate, or whether you somehow rose above your outward fate, defying the degradation internally.
Absolutely. And we see this choice playing out through the predictable psychological phases Frankl describes for the inmates. Phase 1 was shock, which was often characterized by what he called the delusion of reprieve. When they were first interned, prisoners often clung to this naive, almost manic hope that maybe it wouldn't be so bad after all.
Denial, basically.
A form of denial, yes. They believed, or wanted to believe, they might be home by Christmas, or that rumors of gas chambers were just rumors. This shock, this delusion, was brutally shattered by things like the selection process, the SS officer casually pointing left or right, life or death, and, for Frankl personally, that shattering realization when his manuscript was dismissed with that capo's scornful shit. That was the moment his entire former life seemed utterly devalued and lost.
And after that initial shock wore off came the far longer, deeper phase, apathy, or what he called emotional death. This sounds like a necessary protective shell, but one that potentially cost the prisoner his essential humanity.
It was often a vital defense mechanism, yes, but devastating in its effects. Apathy meant becoming indifferent, blunting your emotional responses to horrific scenes, the constant sight of fellow prisoners dying, the pervasive stench, the endless beatings and humiliations. Survival was reduced almost entirely to primitive life. Frankl details this obsessive focus on food. They'd calculate calories constantly, dream only of food, and the only subject that held real sustained interest was the distribution of rations.
A complete narrowing of focus.
Profound narrowing. And a profound lack of sentimentality. He describes men sleeping 9 deep on a single wooden tier, crammed together like livestock, unable even to stretch out properly. Yet, paradoxically, they exhibited this intense fear of being conspicuous, avoiding attracting any attention from the guards that might lead to an arbitrary beating or worse. Just survive, stay invisible.
And yet, despite that total regression towards the primitive, certain men, as you said, achieved a kind of transcendence. How did they manage to break through that thick, protective shell of apathy? Where did that strength come from?
They accessed that inner freedom, that last freedom, through what Frankl saw as spiritual achievements even in those conditions. He vividly recalls marching to a worksite one freezing morning, utterly exhausted, his feet raw, being shouted at by guards, and suddenly his mind just leaped past the barbed wire, past the cold, past the misery. He began communicating silently, intensely with the image of his wife. He didn't even know if she was still alive.
But the connection was real for him.
Incredibly real. And he realized in this flash of profound insight that the true meaning of existence, the ultimate goal, resided in love. He understood that while his body was enslaved, his inner life, his memories, his dedication, his love could never be taken away by external forces. The salvation of man, he concluded right there on that freezing march, is through love and in love.
Those moments of inner vision, whether it was connecting with a loved one or even just appreciating a moment of natural beauty, they seem to have been absolute spiritual lifelines.
They were moments of defiance against the dehumanizing environment. He describes another time watching a group of utterly dejected prisoners staring out through the grimy windows of the mud huts of their Bavarian camp at a magnificent sunset painting the sky. And one prisoner suddenly exclaimed to the others how beautiful the world could be. These moments weren't just brief diversions. They were powerful affirmations that the human spirit could still perceive beauty and meaning, even when utterly surrounded by filth and ugliness and death. It validated that Nietzsche, quote, not just intellectually, but deep in their souls. As Frankl often reflected, echoing Dostoevsky, there is only one thing that I dread, not to be worthy of my sufferings. It's the ultimate internal measure of dignity, isn't it? Choosing how you bear what cannot be changed.
That's incredibly moving. It leads perfectly into the next point, I think.
Yes. Key takeaway 3. Meaning is discovered, even in suffering.
Okay, so if the underlying premise of logotherapy is that life inherently has purpose, then logically, suffering and even dying must also have a potential purpose. This is perhaps the hardest concept for modern people, certainly in Western cultures, to accept. We're so focused on avoiding pain.
It is very challenging because we are often conditioned to believe that suffering is fundamentally negative, pointless, something to be eliminated at all costs immediately. Frankl outlines 3 main avenues through which we can discover meaning in life, and the third one addresses this challenge head-on.
Let's quickly cover the first 2.
Yeah.
They seem like the more maybe obvious or easier paths to meaning.
Right. The first is the most straightforward, finding meaning through creative work or doing a deed. This is the meaning we find through active contribution, building something, achieving a goal, dedicating ourselves to a task or a vocation that contributes something to the world, making a difference.
Makes sense.
The second is finding meaning by experiencing something or encountering someone. This is fulfilled through appreciating goodness, truth, beauty, perhaps in art or nature, or most profoundly, through experiencing another human being in their uniqueness, through love. Frankl calls love the only way to grasp another human being in the innermost core of his personality. Love allows us to see their potential, their essence, not just their current reality.
Okay, work and love experience. What about the third avenue, the one really validated by the camps?
The third avenue is finding meaning through the attitude we choose to take toward unavoidable suffering. This is crucial. If a situation is truly unavoidable, like a terminal illness, an irreparable loss, or indeed the conditions of the concentration camps, then the way we choose to bear that suffering, the attitude we adopt towards it, becomes an achievement in itself. It becomes a source of meaning.
So that transforms suffering from just a passive experience, something that happens to you, into a potential moral or spiritual opportunity.
Exactly. It raises the fundamental human question. If I cannot change this difficult situation, how can I use this suffering to change myself for the better? How can I grow through this? Frankl provides some incredibly moving anecdotes from his psychiatric practice and from the camps, illustrating this transformation.
Can you recount the story of the elderly doctor who came to him mourning his wife? It's such a powerful illustration of finding meaning in suffering through the lens of sacrifice.
Yes, it's a classic example. This elderly general practitioner was deeply depressed, completely unable to overcome the grief of losing his wife, whom he had loved very much. Frankl's approach was not to try and minimize the pain or distract him from it, but to reframe its meaning. He asked the doctor simply, "What would have happened, doctor, if you had died first and your wife would have had to survive you?" The doctor immediately replied, "Oh, for her this would have been terrible. How she would have suffered." Frankl then gently pointed out, "You see, doctor, such a suffering has been spared her, and it is you who have spared her this suffering, but now you have to pay for it by surviving and mourning her." The doctor didn't say another word, just shook Frankl's hand and calmly left. The suffering hadn't disappeared, but the meaning of the suffering had changed. It immediately ceased to be just pointless pain. It found a meaning, a purpose, in the context of his love and sacrifice for his wife.
Wow. Just reframing it gave it dignity. And the anecdote of the young woman dying in the camp who seemed almost cheerful in her final days, that's equally profound, isn't it?
It is. Frankl describes visiting a young woman who knew she was dying within days, yet she seemed remarkably calm, even cheerful. She pointed outside the barrack window to a single branch of a chestnut tree, which was just beginning to show a couple of green blossoms. She told Frankl, "I often talk to this tree." Frankl was a bit puzzled. She explained, "I am here. I am here. I am life, eternal life." Her physical life was tragically ending, but her conscious choice to connect with the beauty of nature, to affirm life even in the face of death, to maintain her inner dignity in those final moments. It ensured her death was not a mere fading away, but a triumph of the human spirit. She achieved, Frankl felt, a kind of spiritual greatness.
So suffering ceases to be suffering in a way at the moment it finds a meaning, such as the meaning of a sacrifice or the meaning of inner growth. But as you noted earlier, Frankl is very adamant that this doesn't mean we should seek out pain or glorify unnecessary suffering.
No.
Absolutely not. That's a critical distinction. We must differentiate between unavoidable suffering and avoidable suffering. If suffering is avoidable, if a disease can be cured, if an oppressive situation can be changed, if an injustice can be fought, then the meaningful thing to do is to take action, to remove the cause of the suffering. To passively accept or even cling to unnecessary suffering, Frankl would say, is masochistic, not heroic. Logotherapy is about finding meaning in the irreducible, unavoidable facts of human existence. Finitude, loss, pain, not about making suffering desirable.
That's a really important clarification. Okay, so we have the will to meaning, the last freedom, finding meaning in suffering. What's the final key takeaway?
The final one brings back to practical application, key takeaway 4. Practical techniques to counter the existential vacuum.
Right, because Frankl didn't just give us philosophy. He developed actual therapeutic tools. Logotherapy is a practical approach designed to address the symptoms of that existential vacuum we discussed. Before we get into the techniques themselves, maybe just remind us quickly how that vacuum typically manifests in modern patients, according to Frankl.
Sure. As we touched on, Frankl saw the vacuum manifesting primarily as a kind of underlying boredom, often leading to a destructive trio of behaviors: depression, aggression, and addiction. That feeling of inner emptiness, the inability to fill free time meaningfully. Frankl's own clinical studies seem to confirm this correlation. He reported finding that something like 90% of the alcoholics and virtually 100% of the drug addicts he studied were struggling with a fundamental, often unacknowledged sense of meaninglessness. They were essentially self-medicating the void.
Okay, so if the root problem is this failure to find or connect with external meaning, how do these logotherapeutic techniques actively intervene to break those negative cycles of anxiety, obsession, or despair?
2 key logotherapeutic techniques are particularly well known and quite ingenious, actually. The first is paradoxical intention. This is brilliantly effective, apparently, against phobias and obsessive-compulsive patterns, neuroses that are often perpetuated by what Frankl called anticipatory anxiety. Basically, the patient fears the symptom will occur, and that very fear causes the symptom to recur, which reinforces the fear, creating a vicious cycle.
Right, like performance anxiety, the fear of failing makes you fail.
Exactly, or the fear of blushing makes you blush. Paradoxical intention cleverly disrupts this cycle. It invites the patient to deliberately intend to do or to wish to happen precisely the thing they fear. If you are afraid of, say, trembling in public, you are instructed to try and show people what a champion trembler you are. Tremble as violently as possible. The underlying essential step here is often introducing humor and a degree of self-detachment.
Can you give us some tangible examples of this technique in action? It sounds so counterintuitive.
Frankl gives several compelling examples. There's the man terribly afraid of sweating in social situations. He would enter a room dreading that he'd start perspiring, which of course guaranteed that he would start perspiring profusely. When treated with paradoxical intention, he was encouraged to actively decide that the next time he was in that situation, he would show people just how much he could sweat. He'd tell himself beforehand, I used to sweat only a quart, but now I'm going to pour out at least 10 quarts.
And it worked.
Apparently, after suffering for years, he was permanently free of the phobia after just one session. By forcing himself to intend the symptom with humor, the fear dissipates, the anticipatory anxiety is short-circuited, and the compulsion is broken. He can't produce the symptom on command because the intention itself removes the underlying anxiety that fueled it.
That seems to use the power of self-distancing, almost like the prisoners using humor in the camps, to gain perspective and control.
It does, very much so. It enables the patient to distance themselves from their neurosis, often through a kind of therapeutic self-mockery. Frankl reported successfully treating a woman who had suffered from a severe washing compulsion for 60 years using this method. By applying paradoxical intention, essentially asking her to intend to be as dirty as possible or embrace the germs, the cycle was broken, and she was reportedly cured in just 2 months. Similarly, chronic insomnia, which is often a result of hyperintention, trying too hard to sleep, is treated by having the person paradoxically intend to stay awake as long as possible. This removes the pressure, allowing sleep to naturally ensue once the desperate effort is gone.
That's fascinating. It really highlights the power of our own intentions and fears. What about the second main technique, dereflection?
De-reflection is designed to counteract hyper-reflection, which means paying excessive attention to oneself or one's problems or symptoms. This is particularly relevant, as you mentioned, to performance anxieties, especially things like sexual neuroses, where trying too hard to achieve pleasure or potency almost guarantees failure because the person is watching themselves, judging themselves, instead of being present in the experience.
So the therapeutic goal here is to shift the focus outward, away from the self and its anxieties.
Exactly. Frankl argues quite strongly against the modern psychological obsession with self-actualization as a direct goal. He believed self-actualization, fulfilling one's potential, is not an attainable aim. If you strive for it directly, you'll just become more self-absorbed. Instead, he saw it as only possible as a side effect of self-transcendence.
Self-transcendence,
Meaning dedicating oneself to a cause greater than oneself, or to loving another person more than oneself. The goal is essentially to forget yourself by giving yourself to something or someone else. De-reflection as a technique actively helps the patient shift their focus away from the problem, their anxiety, their symptoms, their self-observation, and towards the meaning that is waiting to be fulfilled out there in the world, maybe in a task, in a relationship, in service to others.
So that ties the practical techniques directly back to the core philosophical principle of logotherapy, that truly meaningful living requires looking outward, towards the world and others, not constantly inward at ourselves.
Precisely. It all comes together.
Okay. This brings us towards wrapping up our discussion. What are the main closing thoughts we should leave our listeners with from this incredibly rich book?
Well, I think this philosophy, born from the darkest possible human circumstances, ultimately provides a profoundly optimistic, though demanding view of human potential and, crucially, human responsibility. It suggests that ultimately man is self-determining. We aren't just puppets of our biology or our environment.
And Frankl always insisted, didn't he, that freedom is only half the story. That the positive aspect of freedom isn't just freedom from constraint, but freedom for responsibility. We often talk about freedom from things, but maybe less about freedom to or freedom for something.
Exactly. He put it beautifully. Freedom is in danger of degenerating into mere arbitrariness unless it is lived in terms of responsibleness. Frankl asserts that you can predict the behavior of a machine, an automaton, maybe even an animal to some extent, but you cannot truly predict the behavior of a human being in the same way. Man always retains the unique capacity to rise above his conditions, whether they're biological, psychological, or sociological, at any given instant. The key is how he chooses to answer the questions that life asks of him, moment by moment. He is responsible for answering them.
And this emphasis on responsibility, it extends into how we view time itself, doesn't it? Particularly how we view the past and the future and the transitoriness of life. We tend to view aging and the passing of time with a kind of dread, often as just a loss of potential.
We certainly do in Western culture. But Frankl urges us to completely reframe this fear. Instead of viewing transitoriness as a tragedy, as potential draining away, he suggests we should look back at the past not as a stubble field of loss, but as a full granary. He makes the really astonishing claim that old age is not something to be pitied, but rather that young people should actually envy the old.
Envy the old. In our culture that absolutely idolizes youth and future potential, that is profoundly counterintuitive, we tend to pity the elderly for their perceived lack of future possibilities.
Because we misunderstand the nature of assets, Frankl would say. The young person possesses possibilities, which are inherently fragile. They might be realized or they might not. They are potential, not actuality. The old person, however, possesses realities. Nothing and nobody can ever take away the accomplishments they have achieved, the loves they have loved, and importantly, the sufferings they have gone through with courage and dignity. Those things are irrevocably stored and treasured in the granary of the past.
So the past becomes an immutable asset, not a source of regret.
Exactly. It's a profound philosophical reassurance. Everything you have lived through meaningfully, everything you have done with dignity, every challenge overcome is safe forever. It cannot be undone. That shifts the focus entirely from worrying about what I might do in the uncertain future to valuing what I have already become through my actions and choices in the past. It's a way to dignify not just achievement, but also loss and suffering that has been borne well.
That really is the ultimate antidote to nihilism, isn't it? The feeling that nothing matters. And this leads us, I suppose, to the ultimate choice that Frankl witnessed daily in the camps, a choice that, for him, defined what it means to be human.
Yes, the ultimate contrast that separates us potentially from just being biological machines.
The two poles of human potential.
He concludes the book with that incredibly powerful, chilling summary of human capability. Since Auschwitz, he writes, we know what man is capable of, and since Hiroshima, we know what is at stake. Man is the being who invented the gas chambers of Auschwitz, who committed atrocities of unthinkable scale and cruelty. But, Frankl insists, man is also the being who entered those same gas chambers upright, with the Lord's Prayer or the Shema Yisrael on his lips. The being who could share his last scrap of bread, who could comfort another, choosing human dignity over biological decay right up to the very end.
That responsibility, that choice between those two potentials rests with us now, in every moment. So the final motivational nudge, the kind of imperative that Frankl leaves us with, to try and live a fully meaningful and responsible life. It's this profound challenge, isn't it? Live as if you were living already for the second time.
And as if you had acted the first time as wrongly as you are about to act now. It is the ultimate call to conscious living. It compels us to treat every single moment as a unique, unrepeatable opportunity, knowing that while nothing from the past can ever be undone, every present moment can be dignified and given permanent value through the responsible choice we make right now. It puts the weight of existence squarely on our shoulders, but in a potentially empowering way.
A heavy, but ultimately hopeful message born from the deepest darkness. That's today's breakdown. While this discussion cannot replace the book's full text, it can offer a glimpse into its teachings. I hope you found this discussion helpful, and I look forward to sharing more. Let me know what book next you want to discuss.